Have y'all ever been in a theater before watching a movie and you feel like you're having a completely different experience from everyone else? Like everyone's laughing, everyone's having a good time, everyone seems to get it, and you don't get it. You walk out of the theater and everyone is like talking about how much they loved it, how it's going to be a classic, and you're just thinking to yourself, that's not what happened for me? Well, that's what happened when I went to go watch The Holdovers for the first time last November with my best friend. We were honestly a little bored and we were really confused at the audience's reactions. I feel like for months after that, I was watching and reading reviews on TikTok and Letterboxd and Twitter where people were like praising this movie. It made me second guess my initial take on this movie. So I just talked to my wife about it and I kind of forced her to watch it with me because I seriously needed some validation at this point. And watching it again only reinforced how I felt the first time. By now, The Holdovers was getting Oscar buzz, and I feel like the dissonance between my experience and what seemingly a lot of other people are feeling around this movie kind of led me down a rabbit hole of wanting to look for as many interviews and reviews as I could find. In multiple interviews with Alexander Payne, he mentions a list of films that he had Dominic Sessa watch in order to prepare for his role as Angus Tully. I watched most of his recommendations, and I'd seen some of them before, but most of them were new to me. I gathered that he's really into movies about outsiders, films that are very humanist, and character-driven adventures about connection. I mean, it was a treat to go through these recommendations, because I feel like you're watching films that have first and foremost a perspective. And I think that's a big part of what was missing in The Holdovers for me. And I want to explore that with y'all using some of his filmic references and some of my own. Alexander Payne set out to make the film that he would have made had he been directing in the 70s. The Holdovers takes place in the winter of 1970 to 1971 at an all-boys boarding school in Massachusetts. We get to see the students in their final days of classes before their holiday breaks. Initially, there's a small group of boys who are holding over, and eventually, all except one get to go on a ski trip. The first 30 minutes or so of the movie, before the majority of the kids go on the ski trip, feels like a completely different project. Maybe even a better film. The moment the helicopter took off, honestly, I kind of remember feeling a little like, where are we going now? And so we're left with a curmudgeonly teacher named Paul, a closed-off junior named Tully, a grieving cafeteria manager named Mary, and an often forgotten custodian named Danny. They don't get along at first, and as expected, they have to open up to each other in order to get through the holiday break. According to an interview with Town & Country, Payne said, "The feeling that I was looking for was that it's not a period film. I mean, it's a period film, but I didn't want it to feel like one designed by people now. We see a lot of period movies and TV shows, and they're just too damn designed. They're too period. They almost rub your noses in how period they are. This had to feel as banal and lived in as if we were making a low-budget film then." This quote really gets down to the heart of the problem for me. It feels like he set out to make a film that's banal and undesigned, and in doing so, he also made a film that lacks the charm, whimsy, and heart of his references. One of my biggest grievances with this movie is how it deals with class and race politics. And I kind of feel like Alexander Payne has a habit of dipping his toes in these subjects without fully having anything to say. This was a problem that plagued his previous film Downsizing, which, by the way, I personally really did not like and kind of felt like it was pretty ridiculous. But in The Holdovers, for example, Mary Lamb, the cafeteria manager played by Divine Joy Randolph, had a son named Curtis Ezra Lamb, who we find out was at Barton on scholarship. We also find out early on that he was killed in Vietnam and that he was kind of an outlier among his well-to-do peers. We also learn that the teacher, Paul Hunnam, played by Paul Giamatti, was a former scholarship kid during his time at Barton, who later went on to get expelled from Harvard because he was falsely accused by a legacy student of plagiarizing. We eventually learn that that's at least part of the reason for why he's so hard on his mostly privileged students.
Vulgar, rancid little Philistines.
Oh, and the last holdover is Danny, the custodial worker played by Naeem Garcia, whom we know literally nothing about.
Good morning, everybody.
Hi, Danny.
A lot of this movie feels really performative, considering that it doesn't really say anything about class. The cynical attitude that the movie has toward class feels very surface, and I can't help but feel that it has something to do with the fact that it was both written and performed by Yale legacy admits, ironically enough. You know, I'm not necessarily trying to make a video about Nepo babies, especially not in this climate, but it does kind of feel like it's one of the themes in the film. I actually just learned last year that Paul Giamatti's father was a Yale University professor who literally went on to become the president of Yale. Hello, editor comrade here, even though my wife is the actual editor. We're finishing up the video right now, but she just sent me the most ridiculous tweet about how apparently Paul Giamatti's dad, when he was like president at Yale, how he arrested anti-apartheid protesters. And it felt kind of ridiculous not to mention, especially given everything happening on Yale and Columbia's campuses right now. So I'm gonna attach that for y'all to read. Paul Giamatti, by the way, has a BFA and an MFA from Yale, and last year was awarded an honorary PhD from, you guessed it, Yale. Though I didn't know this on my first watch, I was definitely not convinced by his monologue in the liquor store where he basically just talks about the injustices of Nepo babies. On the second watch, it was honestly kind of funny, and it made it really hard to take the whole thing seriously. I kept asking myself, how can he deliver these lines about Nepo babies knowing that he's literally a Nepo baby?
That blue-blooded prick's family had allies on the faculty. I mean, their last name is on a library, for Christ's sakes.
And then the screenwriter, David Hemingson's father, was like friends with Paul Giamatti's father while they were both at Yale. I don't know why specifically a Nepo baby would write such an anti-Nepo baby character for another Nepo baby to play. But I don't know. Maybe that's just something to think about.
You know, Mr. Kuntz, for most people, life is like a henhouse ladder, shitty and short. You were born lucky.
I want to start off Payne's references by discussing The Last Detail, because it's a film that follows the most similar narrative structure to The Holdovers. It's a bit of a 70s odyssey, as two sailors in the Navy, Badusky and Mulhall, played by Jack Nicholson and Otis Young, have to escort a naive 18-year-old Meadows, played by Randy Quaid, up the east coast of the United States. They make this journey from Virginia to Maine because Meadows has been sentenced to 8 years in prison for a $40 theft.
I didn't get no $40.
Didn't get it?
No.
In the preface to the new edition of the novel, The Last Detail, author Daryl Ponnickson says that the military puts you in a place where all things are possible, and not in a good way. I listened to the old salt talk about the detail. At times, fall off the seat funny, at other times, hopelessly sad. My writer's radar pinged. The story was perfect. A messed up kid who didn't want to be trouble for anybody, put into the hands of two lifers, torn between a keen sense of duty and a mission they knew was wrong, between mild contempt for the kid and a begrudging affection. As soon as I could find a place and some moments to be alone, I started writing. Ponnickson worked as a social worker in Los Angeles before publishing his debut novel, and it really seems to me like he has a lot of experience working with vulnerable and blue-collar people. And I think that's at least part of why this is such a rich story. Now, I don't know how true the film is to the novel, but the film was quite heartbreaking. Badusky is a larger-than-life character, and we see how the Navy manages his time. It's made apparent to us throughout the entire film that he's a lifer, and so he's basically in this institution until he's of retirement age. I mean, there's a lot to say about a person with a sense of duty to what will ultimately amount to his life's work, and how that's in conflict with this other sense of duty to his own humanity. It's quite powerful to see how these two obligations are in contrast with one another, and I feel like the movie really packs all of the emotions that are wound up in this contrast into every scene. Maybe one of the most noticeable things to me in this movie was how cold they were. Like, they were literally putting their hands in their pockets and shivering the entire film. Like, it was a constant thought in my head. Like, how cold winter can be. Like, how painful winter can be. For me, this atmosphere building detail was one of the ways that the film was constantly reminding me that they're not just hanging out. This is their job, and the conditions of the work are harsh. During the Holdovers, there's a scene early on where Tully says that it's like 15 degrees outside. And literally nobody seems cold in this movie. Nobody's wearing ear coverings, hats, gloves, or scarves, and they're literally walking around in 15-degree snowy weather in like chukka boots. I want to use one more quote from the preface of The Last Detail. I am a veteran of the war in Vietnam, according to the motorcycle club that not long ago took me in. But I'd been with the 6th Fleet and never fired a shot in anger during the war. I was hardly aware of the war until I became a student at Cornell, when it became hard to turn your awareness to anything else. In Los Angeles, I became part of the anti-war protest. Though it is not a theme in The Last Detail, the Vietnam War is on every page. When I watched this movie, it was obvious that it had a perspective and that it knew what it was saying. So then going back and watching The Holdovers and hearing Paul say,
the world doesn't make sense anymore. It's on fire. The rich don't give a shit. Poor kids are cannon fodder. Integrity's a punchline. Trust is just a name on a bank.
it felt empty because sure, you can have your characters say all of these things, but if you aren't actually dealing with it in your movie, then what are you actually doing? One of the other films that Alexander Payne mentioned over and over again during the press tour of this movie was Hal Ashby's directorial debut, The Landlord. This is an experimental and energetic movie about a wealthy, unemployed 29-year-old Long Islander, Elgar Enders, played by Beau Bridges, who lives with his family and then decides to run away from home by buying a brownstone in the historically black neighborhood of Park Slope, Brooklyn. This was by far my favorite of the first 4 Hal Ashby movies that I watched for this video. I instantly noticed how impressive the script was, and I could not believe that Hal Ashby was capable of writing such good dialogue for working-class black people in Brooklyn. I'd assumed he wrote it because it was his first feature, but as it turns out, it was actually written by Bill Gunn, who famously went on to write and direct Ganja and Hess. And you can tell that it wasn't just written by a privileged white guy, because the script is just too good, and the script navigates the complexities and the tensions in these relationships really well. Though Elgar is ostensibly the protagonist, the film doesn't default to operating from his perspective. The black characters in The Landlord don't exist to help him grow, and I think that's a huge reason for why they don't feel like one-dimensional stereotypes. They don't pity him, and it's because of this that we see real character development. To be quite honest, the white guy in this movie is written with way more nuance than literally any other character in The Holdovers. He was written so truthfully that he's identical to an ex-boyfriend of mine. Elgar also doesn't pity his tenants, and in him, Gunn is able to craft a character who isn't just a wealthy and racist stereotype, nor is he a white savior. Elgar very clearly goes into his real estate endeavor as naive, carefree, and ultimately destructive, and that's what's truly horrifying about him, and also what makes him an insightful depiction of the way that white people move through the world. I think there's a lot to be said about how this movie relates to issues around gentrification, colonization, the housing crisis, and a myriad of other issues that feel so relevant to us today. I really want to keep talking about this movie, but I don't want to spoil it too much. I highly recommend it. It blew me away. Back to The Holdovers, I think we need to talk about Divine Joy Randolph's character, Mary Lamb. As I'm writing this, she just won her first Oscar for Best Supporting Actress, and I don't want to downplay what a monumental achievement this is for her career. However, I wasn't really convinced by her character, and I don't feel comfortable commenting on her performance, considering the material that she was given. According to various interviews, she was cast because of her performance in Dolomite Is My Name, which was also written and directed by a team of white guys and was kind of barely even a movie. I will say though, it's probably a lot more fun of a watch than The Holdovers, and it made me really curious about the original Dolomite movies. Unfortunately though, once again, her character felt one-dimensional, but kind of on the opposite side of the spectrum as the sort of loud protege to Eddie Murphy's Dolomite. It's unfortunate to see her in these roles, though admittedly these are the only 2 films I've seen her in, and I hope I get to see her play more nuanced and complex characters in the future. According to an article in Vanity Fair, Mary was loosely based off of Hemingson's mother and the socioeconomic divides he witnessed as a child. He says, "I'm not old enough to have been in the Vietnam War, obviously, but all the guys that I knew growing up, their brothers or uncles, a lot of them had gone. and I noticed it was mostly poor kids and black kids who were going. You see it, and you see the systemic issues and the injustice, and I started thinking what it would be like for my mom who loved me so ferociously to lose me, so I channeled that. I don't really know what to say about this quote because it's pretty ridiculous and I'm kind of at a loss for words. Like, I'm not really sure what he thought he was trying to do with this exercise, but it reminds me a lot of Dana Schutz's painting of Emmett Till that was up at the Whitney back in 2017. Quite frankly, I don't think he's doing whatever it is that he thinks he's doing, considering that he probably would have been exempt from the draft because he literally went to Yale. I just can't imagine being like, wow, my mom loves me so much. Imagine if I was a poor black kid who died in Vietnam. Imagine how much that would suck for her. Like, what is that? It's really disheartening, but for me, Mary Lamb is a one-note character. She epitomizes the strong and silent black woman who is absorbing so much until she literally bursts. Her climactic scene is honestly quite short, and then in the very next scene, she's just back to lecturing Paul again.
You don't tell a boy that's been left behind at Christmas that you're aching to cut him loose, that nobody wants him? What the fuck is wrong with you?
Like, Paul wants to leave the party because he's probably embarrassed about what happened with Miss Crane, and then Tully wants to stay because of her niece. And neither of these reasons have literally anything to do with Mary.
Are you trying to look down my shirt?
No. Yes.
The movie barely scratches the surface when it comes to Mary's grief. She's kind of barely in the movie, and then when she is in the movie, she's basically just telling Paul to go easy on Tully again. At no point in the entire film do Paul or Tully ever do anything as selfless or even just helpful for Mary. It's very clear that she exists for them. When Paul gives meditations to Mary, he compares it to the Bible and says that the best part of it is that there's no mention of God, and then proceeds to give this gift to a grieving Christian woman. Meanwhile, she gifts him a leather-bound notebook for him to write his monograph. Like with so many other mediocre films, her character just exists to handhold the two main leads, and she basically functions as an endlessly giving mother to both of them. I genuinely have a hard time believing all the people who are saying that this film feels as though it was made in the 70s and then was just put away in a vault for 50 years. Literally, I was Joe Stem. Honestly, the two biggest reasons why I went to go see this film in the first place were because of the whip zoom shot from the trailer, which was being advertised to me literally nonstop on Instagram, and then the motion picture soundtrack cover that was designed by Nate Carlson. These eventually ended up being false promises, and I want to get into the whip zoom shot a little bit later. The opening logos, also by Carlson, were actually pretty good. They were honestly really fun, and they were convincingly of the period. This just made the opening scene all the more disappointing when it was obviously not shot on film. And this is unfortunate since they apparently went to great lengths to make it feel as though it was shot 50 years ago. Maybe this is because I'm a photographer who's primarily shot on film, but the realization that this was shot digitally was like almost immediate. And although the colors are mostly fine, sometimes it gets a little too green and orange for me. I also thought a lot of the bigger dust specks were kind of distracting because it felt like it was the same dust speck just kind of appearing over and over like pretty randomly. I haven't seen too many films shot by Eigil Brield, but I have to say Ocean's 8 is probably one of the most unfortunate looking films I've literally ever seen. According to the cinematographer, they chose to not shoot on film because of COVID-era supply chain issues and because they would have still needed to manipulate the film image to have the 70s look that they were going for. Like I said before, the overall look and feel wasn't necessarily bad, it just wasn't especially striking. I did enjoy some of the compositions though. I remember thinking this shot was pretty when Paul lights his pipe in the theater, and there's this other shot where Tully is reading a book and his sweater matches the couch, and I really liked how that one was lit. Oh, and then there's this other one where the classroom goes from cool natural light washing over empty seats, and that transitions to warm light from the overheads shining on the handful of holdovers. There's definitely some pleasing cinematography that I genuinely appreciated. Especially after watching Harold and Maude in The Last Detail, I can see what they were going for with The Holdovers. I really enjoyed the use of long lenses in that film. I think just overall, I might be more interested in Gordon Willis's approach with The Landlord, but I also was just really moved by that movie. This isn't the first picture that's tried to authentically recreate a previous decade. Alexander Payne uses one of my very favorite movies as a reference. Peter Bogdanovich's 1973 masterpiece, Paper Moon, successfully brings me back to Depression-era Hollywood talkies. Movies of this time are often dealing with escapist themes and are told through the lens of social realism, which MoMA describes as a movement that flourished between the two world wars in response to the social and political turmoil and the hardships of the period. Artists turned to realism as a way of making art easily accessible and legible to the wider public, often portraying their subjects, including well-known figures and anonymous everyday workers, as heroic symbols of persistence and strength in the face of adversity. Through their work, they aimed to call attention to the declining conditions of the poor and working classes, and to challenge the governmental and social systems they held responsible. Paper Moon is a road comedy that takes place in 1936 through the Midwest when a con man, Moses Prey, played by Ryan O'Neal, gets stuck with his past lover's 8-year-old, too smart for her own good daughter, Addie Loggins, played by O'Neal's real-life daughter, Tatum. He agrees to take her from Kansas to Missouri, and obviously along the way, hijinks ensue. As the duo grows closer, they start running cons together. Paper Moon is breathtaking. It's the rare example of a film that can make you well up without leaving you feeling manipulated into it. It's so moving without being overly sentimental. Paper Moon isn't less predictable than The Holdovers, but by the end, you feel that these characters have grown enough together that for all intents and purposes, he really is her father, and she will always choose him because they see themselves in each other. We watch them go through a series of highs and lows during what's already such a painful period of American history. We don't know much about their backgrounds, but the strength of the writing and the two performances leads you to believe that they must be connected somehow, like that they've always needed each other. In The Holdovers, the plot plows forward towards an obvious conclusion that feels like a requirement to get us to a point where Paul Hunnam gives us something selfless. All of its sentimentality feels like plot requirement and not like an earned emotional connection. For me, it feels forced, and I know this might be a controversial take, but I feel like Dominic Sessa's stilted performance didn't really help. Also, I think it's more fun to watch an 8-year-old tomboy be your hero than a middle-aged ass. Paper Moon is so pure of heart, witty, timeless, and most of all, gorgeous. Laszlo Kovacs does a beautiful job using period-appropriate cinematography techniques such as wide lenses to achieve deep focus. The composition of the frames and the blocking of characters works beautifully on this black and white film. This is a film that feels impeccably crafted and is worth a watch, if even just for Madeline Kahn's monologue as Trixie Delight or the long take in the car with Addie and Moses. What a picture. Also, literally everyone had some version of a 1930s period accent, and this was a detail that felt distractingly absent from The Holdovers. Dominic Sessa and Paul Giamatti are very much speaking in their normal voices.
Don't buy that, Harry. He's ripping you off. Plus, it's ditchweed.
One thing that was noticeable from watching all of these movies from the 70s was that everyone spoke in a different cadence back then. It's like when you watch a 90s movie and you just know that nobody talks like that anymore, like nobody sounds like Parker Posey. Divine Joy Randolph has said that she worked on an accent to prepare for this role, and while I do appreciate that, I don't think it necessarily sounded like a 1970s accent.
You should have been here this morning for the Tenants Association rent strike.
Rent strike? What rent strike?
Don't worry, there ain't gonna be no rent strike.
No, wait, now, are you sure?
I ain't gonna be in a rent strike. Ain't nobody paid no rent as long as I can remember.
Go easy on them.
Oh, please. They've had it easy their whole lives.
You don't know that. Did you? Besides, everybody should be with their people on Christmas.
Another movie that I've thought about a lot since watching The Holdovers was Richard Ayoade's 2010 film, Submarine. This isn't a film that Payne has talked about, but I feel like it's worth bringing up because they have some commonalities. They're both doing an homage to different periods in film history, and they both kind of have these troublemaker prep school leads. Submarine takes place in Wales and follows the 15-year-old Oliver Tate, played by Craig Roberts, who is honestly kind of a little freak. He's obsessed with his parents' sex life and is always imagining his life as if it's a movie about himself. It's not just a film about getting the girl, Jordana Bevan, played by Jasmine Page. It's about all the ways he selfishly loses the girl. During the movie, there are points where Oliver says and does things that make him honestly unlikable. Oliver epitomizes the self-important teenager that most of us were at some point in our lives. It's Oliver's world and we're just living in it. Usually I'm hesitant to praise relatability in movies, but it just really works in this one. Partially because Oliver has an overwhelming charm, charisma, and a pureness about him. Craig Roberts did an amazing job in this movie and brought even more humor and depth to an already densely written character.
Why don't you go fuck yourself? Fucking big gay.
I mean, all the characters in this movie feel fully realized, and the story pretty much only takes unexpected turns. I'm particularly interested in how this movie handles cliches. It's very of its time, and it's being so referential of the 60s. It's kind of a miracle this movie even works. It seems like it's just gonna be bad tweed Tumblr mood board material, with its use of handheld Super 8 memory sequences, Polaroid first kisses, cigarette-smoking teenagers, non-diegetic collages, setting things on fire, new wave fourth wall breaks, lens flares, close-ups, and quick cuts. The list goes on, and somehow it's so masterful in how it handles all of it. Like, it really should be so cringe, and somehow it's just not cringe at all. It's a movie that successfully uses its influence of 60s new wave to make a modern movie that honors its inspirations. Meanwhile, the aforementioned whip zoom literally made me roll my eyes in the theater the first time I watched it. It was cringe and felt completely unearned, and it didn't really match with the tone of the rest of the movie. There's a low-budget sort of campiness to a whip zoom that I think deserves respect.
Sometimes I wish there was a film crew following my every move. I imagine the camera craning up as I walk away. But unless things improve, the biopic of my life will only have the budget for a zoom out.
According to Technical Film and TV for Non-Technical People, back in the 1960s when zoom lenses came into wide usage, the sudden zoom shot, known as a crash zoom, was often used to show a character's shock or surprise or realization. Nowadays, the effect is considered dated, especially when it is used to parody the earlier style. By the way, this book is over 20 years old. Sorry for honing in on this whip zoom, I just personally have a soft spot for them. I made a flip book a few years ago about a fictional whip zoom, and as a photographer, I'm always really interested in the relationship between pictures and motion pictures. I also want to talk about the scenes surrounding the whip zoom. Within the span of 1 minute, we're awkwardly wiping into the scene where Paul is buying a Christmas tree. Then we're in this bizarre Dutch angle where Mary and Paul are in the kitchen. And then we're zooming out on him calling Tully. I haven't seen anyone else talk about that 1 minute of time, but I literally felt like I got whiplash when I watched it. I couldn't get into the Dutch angles, like the one in the dining hall didn't work for me either. And although I appreciate the wipes more, I also wasn't super into how they were used. But I do want to say my favorite part of the Holdovers was probably the use of dissolves. I admire the conviction to use them despite the fact that they've fallen out of favor, and there were a lot of really beautiful ones. In an interview, Payne says that he loves long dissolves because they're so pretty and related to poetry. If you can't solve it, dissolve it. Based on the Alexander Payne interviews I've watched, my impression is that he's not the most aesthetically minded. He stated in an interview with AFI that the two most important things are your screenplay and casting, which, as an aside, that made his movie Downsizing even more confusing to me, but that's a whole other thing. I think what he wants is to make something raw. In an interview with Collider, he quotes Antonioni and says, that one has to figure out where would people go naturally, and then you just have to make a well-shot documentary about it. And admittedly, a lot of this is in contrast to how I usually approach the movies that I'm drawn to, but I do think that if this is going to be the basis of how you tell your story, then your script and your cast have to be excellent, and this just wasn't the case with The Holdovers. With Paul Giamatti, I feel like it's safe to say that he's a pretty reliable actor. Like, he's not necessarily going to pull you out of the scene, but I also was not necessarily moved by his performance in this movie. He knows what he's doing, but it's not breathtaking or anything. And then my impression of Dominic Sessa's performance was that it was very stilted. Watching both the lines he gave to his father and then the popular slow zoom scene with the monologue to Paul felt awkward and too contained.
He was my dad.
Honestly, it was unfortunate because Paul's response in that scene was just noticeably a better and more dynamic performance. I spent the entire movie not fully convinced by Sessa's performance and sometimes being taken out of the scene altogether. In the museum, when they're looking at candy cane,
It's candy cane.
on the plate, and then Tully goes,
When you say it that way.
and then it fades into Cat Stevens, like, what is that? I love Cat Stevens, but that line delivery was so flat, and then that transition just did not work for me. My wife and I talked about how if Tully had actually been a well-developed character, then his line, "This is the most bullshit ever,"
This is the most bullshit ever. The most bullshit ever.
would be pretty iconic, honestly. Overall, though, it felt impossible for me to see him as a fully realized character. I mean, we don't really know anything about Tully or about Mary. I think this is best exemplified by Paul giving them the same present, and sure, this is done more as like a jab at Paul's character.
So you just get this for everybody?
But as an audience, do we even know what would have been a more appropriate gift for either of them? A film that I think has a similar ethos is Whit Stillman's 1990 film, Metropolitan. I mean, Metropolitan and Last Days of Disco kind of go against what I'm usually looking for in a movie. It's not particularly visually striking, costuming is fine, set design is fine. Honestly, a lot of it is kind of out of focus, but it is, in my opinion, one of the best dialogue-driven scripts I've ever watched. I was fortunate enough to get to watch this movie alongside a Q&A with Whit Stillman, and literally to this day, I still regret not listening to my wife and wearing a tuxedo to the event. If we want to talk about casting, breakout star Chris Eichman is so funny in his delivery of every single line, and his character is also so unapologetically unlikable. This casting must have been the find of the century. That's a movie where casting and script get you so far. I know only like 3 people are gonna watch this, but if you want me to do a video on the Doomed Bourgeois in Love trilogy, please let me know. I think overall The Holdovers isn't a bad movie. It's definitely not Alexander Payne's worst. It just wasn't a film that really worked for me, or one that I was able to have an emotional connection toward. Mostly I thought it was too long, and I honestly was kind of surprised when people were calling it cozy given the length. Even Payne has said in interviews that he feels like Election is his only film that doesn't feel too long, and I'd agree with that. At least he's self-aware. I also thought the cast had better chemistry in Election. Jessica Campbell, may she rest in peace, was by far the best part of that movie for me.
It's not like I'm a lesbian or anything. I'm attracted to the person. It's just that all the people I've ever been attracted to happen to be girls.
Like, her election speech was so funny and so high school.
So vote for me, because I don't even want to go to college. And I don't care. And as president, I won't do anything.
I feel like that was a big thing for me that was missing in The Holdovers. Like, I really did not think it was funny. And I might just be looking for something else when it comes to comedy. Coming back to length, there's a scene in The Holdovers where they're setting off some kind of firework in the kitchen, and then it fades to black. And you know, the movie can't end there, but it's almost like a relief, and then suddenly it just keeps going. The opening 30 minutes before the helicopter takes off is definitely the best part of the movie for me. At the end of all of this, I really want to take the time to say that I am grateful to Alexander Payne for his list of references that he gave to Dominic Sessa. There's still a couple movies in his list that I will eventually watch. As far as Hal Ashby goes, I'd only ever seen Harold and Maude like back in high school, but I was really moved by his work this time around. I didn't really talk about Shampoo in this video, but his first 4 films were really impressive, and it makes sense. Hal Ashby is a silent generation bohemian who grew up during the Depression. I mean, a guy like that, he's gonna have a lot to say, and he's also gonna have a really unique perspective from which to say it. Also, if I hadn't felt like I was having such a different experience to my fellow audience members, I probably wouldn't have taken the time to watch all those interviews and make this video. So, thank you, Alexander Payne. Your references were better than your movie. As a final thought, I just want to say how much I respect Payne's dedication to the language of cinema. I hope we get to see the use of thoughtful fades in more films in the future. Alright, I think that's everything. We'll see if I make another one of these. Thank y'all so much for watching. When you put it that way, and then Cat Stevens just starts playing. I'm sorry, it's just so ridiculous. Say steady. Speedy. Oh no, Speedy. The opening logo. Speedy. Speedy.